son of a...
So guys, thanks very much for joining us. With me today is Dean, our chief writer. How are you, Dean?
Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, are you drinking to people's legs?
Always.
Always. Today we are talking about the topic that seems to come up probably now on a monthly basis, it feels like. Somebody somewhere publishes an article alluding to a remake of Jaws. And whenever we see this, we always we just breathe a sigh of just, oh, really, again? It's like some of these publications have nothing really better to write about, and whenever a Jaws remake is mentioned, it just causes absolute outrage, controversy, but actually we found really healthy debate, not just between you and I, but across the whole community. When you see articles like sort of a Jaws remake appearing so much, I mean, what do you think about that, and why do you think it keeps happening?
Well, I think obviously it's easy clickbait, as we've seen with other people, or if people write an article dissing Jaws or dissing any other kind of classic film, then it just kind of invites people in, and they know that people are going to click on it. But also, I think there's a kind of an air of inevitability, I suppose, with a film that is 46 years old this year, that there are going to be people who kind of talk about things being remade, especially when there's so many remakes and reimaginings and reboots. So it's the thing that kind of Hollywood has always done, since the silent days, never mind just now. So it's certainly nothing new, so it's never going to stop. And also, I think in this age of people needing instant brand awareness, you're always going to get those kind of big franchise movies, whether it is Godzilla versus Kong, whether it is another Fast and Furious, or whether it is another Star Wars film. Whether they're any good or not is another matter, but there's automatically that kind of inbuilt audience and that inbuilt awareness, so it automatically means that there's kind of less selling to do in some way, shape or form for the studio and for the marketing people.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think just the concept of a remake, whether it's Jaws or another movie, it's a very easy win, I think, because like you say, you've got the built-in audience there, instant recognizability in terms of the franchise. You kind of what you're going to get, maybe with a slightly different sort of spin on it or whatever, or a new cast or a new director. We see it so much with franchises, and after this debate always happens, and as I say, it seems to be sort of every month now, I always go on the hashtag remake. And if you go on it, particularly on Twitter, there's just so much activity around it. So it's always not just a contemporary, but it's a current topic that people are always talking about. There's always something around remake. And I think that whenever Jaws is mentioned, because it's one of those, it's the classic movie, that's the thing, but it's a classic for a reason. It's just so perfect in so many ways. And I think to try and remake a classic that's so perfect in the first place, easy financial win. I think just out of curiosity, a lot of people would be interested in seeing what that looks like. But then, is there going to be too much fan service in something that's sort of that on the nose in terms of it being so, it's a Jaws remake, that's it? Or is there scope for something else maybe? Is it more about a reboot, or is it a prequel, or is it a spin-off TV series now that we're also sort of starting to see happen now? So I'm really keen to explore this, because when I think you and I first started this journey as the Daily Jaws together, when we first started mentioning or discussing remakes, we were both very adamant, like, no, this is not going to happen. It can't happen. You can't remake a classic. We've described Jaws as lightning in a bottle. You can't replicate that. But now I think it's probably more you than I. You're kind of shifting, and you're a little bit more open to the idea, I think, of a remake, or at least revisiting the Jaws universe in some shape or form. Would that be fair to say?
I think so. I guess it's kind of similar. I know there's certain Jaws fans. I know we've done an article on it. I know which kind of Jaws fan are you. There's certain Jaws fans who only recognise the original, and there are no other Jaws films. And there's others who recognise Jaws and Jaws 2 but not the others. And there's others who embrace all four films.
Yeah.
But you could, you could kind of almost, and I think there's almost like same kind of feeling around the Indiana Jones films as well. Obviously, with that, famously, people kind of say there's only three. There's not Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. But it's up to you. You can like whichever films you like, and I think it's the same with the Matrix. I know there's a fourth one of those coming out, but again, people are like, oh, there's only the Matrix. The other two aren't as good. But for me, it's just continuing that universe, and I'm quite happy to kind of see other dives into that universe. We all watch other shark films, and I know everyone says, "Oh, it's not Jaws," and no, they're not, and they don't need to be. But I think from Universal's point of view, it must be very tempting. What with things like The Meg or 47 Meters Down and its sequel, and various other shark films that have kind of come, just in the 21st century alone. There's, ironically, I think there's probably more shark films swimming about than there ever were, and I mean kind of like genuine ones. Kind of the cinema, not the kind of sci-fi channel shark exploitation kind of ones, but those kind of ones that do get released on the big screen or kind of premiered on TV. Those kind of ones seem to be less few and far between than they were. And I think certainly with the likes of Deep Blue Sea, even when that came out in 1999, there hadn't been a shark film at the cinema for ages. But now the kind of the cinematic ocean is kind of swimming with them. So I think it makes an awful lot of sense from a Universal point of view that they would kind of want in on that action. And as we said at the beginning, there's that Jaws brand there, and for better or worse, people would go and see it. Certainly, I know I'd go and see it. It wouldn't stop. It wouldn't. In no way, shape, or form would it replace the original. But you can watch a remake and enjoy the original. It's not an exclusive club where you have to love one and not the other. And I know we've spoken before, whether it's various incarnations of the Invasion and the Body Snatcher films, which I think we're like four versions of now. Yeah. They all bring something slightly different. I know they're all done in different decades and all got different meanings behind them. You could say the same with King Kong. You can like the 1933 version, the 1976 version, and the 2005 Peter Jackson version. You may only like one of those, but you can like more than one if you wish. I think personally, I enjoyed the original Hills of Eyes, but I much prefer the 2005 remake. And I know not many people do, but Poltergeist, they got remade fairly recently as well. A lot of people hate it. I kind of enjoy it and see it on a different level. But conversely, I don't like the remake of the Amityville Horror, and the remake of The Omen is kind of fairly redundant as well. But, I've got it. I've watched it more than once. It doesn't ruin those original films for me. So there's plenty of wiggle room, and, we can all get along and we can all watch it and we can enjoy it or not enjoy it. But I think plenty of people, whether they want a remake or not, I think people would go and watch it.
Yeah, I think the thing for me with it is Jaws, if they did a remake of Jaws, because like you say, some great examples there. There's, some remakes do work. They're really well made. They surpass the originals in certain ways, and they're more enjoyable. And they don't necessarily impact the legacy of the original work either. It's the one that comes to mind for me is Day of the Dead, or is it? No, sorry, Dawn of the Dead. I think it is. So obviously you've got the George A. Romero original '78, and then you've got, I think it was 2004, Zack Snyder's version. Zack Snyder, I think. And I love both of them. I think they're great. Technically, you can't argue that the latter film is superior, because obviously special effects have come along such a long way. The ability to sort of video and record things in certain different ways. There's a beautiful overhead shot of the car driving through its neighborhood right at the very beginning of the remake of Dawn of the Dead. And so for me, from a technical point of view, I think, movie making has moved on, and certain franchises do benefit from a remake, like the one that you talked about before we jumped on the call, was The Evil Dead. I'm a massive fan of The Evil Dead. I love the originals. I think that the tone of them is brilliant, and they are what they are. You know, they're so of their time in terms of the effects that were available, the technology that was available, and it's such a low budget. But then when you look at the new one, it's a very polished version, arguably technically better made, because obviously the technology is just there to allow that to happen. It's very available. Does it tarnish the old one for me? Not necessarily, no. It doesn't. I can see the two very separately and enjoy them independently in the same way as Dawn of the Dead. I think the thing for me as a Jaws fan, and I think this is quite, I don't think I speak for every Jaws fan when I say this, but I think any franchise that kind of goes down the remake route almost becomes a cliche in itself. It's just the inevitable remake that kind of comes along. It's just like, oh, okay, of course they're going to remake it. Whereas by Universal, as tempting as it is, as you say, you know, for them to remake Jaws and make a lot of money out of it and reinvigorate the franchise in some way, I actually think it's a really good statement for the original movie that they're not going to remake it, because they just know that it's perfect as it is. It's good enough. It doesn't need to be remade. So why bother? Why try it? So to your point around finding other ways to explore the universe, I think that would be really interesting. Like, for example, one of my favourite products that came out recently is the Hendrix comic book by What If Stories. I love that. I think I've got it somewhere. I might be able to bring it up, or I'll put a screenshot in the call. And that's by someone who's now become a bit of a mate of mine called Matt. And he works so hard at these things. He's so passionate about the Jaws universe, and in particular this character Hendrix. And for me, I'm like, that's a great way to explore the Jaws universe, because he's our instant connection back to the time of the original Amity incident, if you want to call it that. But then you can also bring him into the modern day, potentially as a retired policeman who's still living on the island. And then maybe there's another shark problem, that kind of thing. Or you could even do that potentially with Hooper as well. You know, maybe he is called back to Amity because there's another shark incident, say 50 years later or something like that, or whatever it happens to be. So there are inroads definitely back to Amity and back to the universe in some way. And I think, like to your point and I think certain fans look at the Jaws franchise, so you've got Jaws 1, 2, 3 and 4, or The Revenge, or whatever you want to call it. I think Jaws, obviously the original, yeah, absolutely 100%. It's, you know, the linchpin, the anchor of the franchise. Jaws 2, I think a lot of people, particularly since the Snyder Cut has been released of Justice League, they want to see the Hancock cut of Jaws 2, because that was just so different. And it's very obvious what John Hancock shot in Jaws 2, and then obviously when he left the production, what else, the tone that it kind of took after that. And I think people are very interested in the darker, grittier, story-driven side, rather than the crowd-pleasing, bums on seats, teen slasher flick on a boat that we basically kind of.
I think that's fine. I think the overall problem with that, and I think it was a similar kind of problem with the Richard Donner cut, which he approved but didn't oversee. It was a Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. Is, although it's very different, it's still got the same ending as the original Superman, where he kind of flies back and spins around the world backwards. Spoiler alert. But I think that's going to be the same problem with because obviously they didn't have a different ending. So I think that's going to be the same with the Hancock, any Hancock footage, is that obviously he had different actors in roles and things. So I think it would only kind of be some kind of, which I'd still love to see, it would be those kind of rushes or whatever else as an extra feature on a kind of extra special Jaws 50th anniversary box set. But I'm sure that's something for another video.
So how about this for a question then, just while we're on the subject of Hancock and Jaws 2. Let's say, and apparently there are copies of this available, I've looked but I can't find one, but if we could find the original Hancock Jaws 2 scripts and then somehow magically get that made, is that something you'd be interested in seeing?
Potentially. I guess it depends who you cast as the lead, certainly with certainly in the Chief Brody role. So I think it kind of depends on those kind of things.
Well, you could potentially deep fake that now, couldn't you? You could deep fake Roy Scheider and just have someone, like, you know, doing his voice or something. It's totally possible. I don't know how
I guess
so. Need to have, you know, during the audition, how well do you tan? That's the question.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I think that's the thing as well. I think this is kind of, I know we're talking about the remake, but and whether there will be one, but I think it's that kind of wider thing, isn't it, about the continuing Jaws legacy? And I think Universal, and we all know that the Jaws franchise is, it's been dead in the water since 1987. So there must be some way of them kind of resurrecting it in some way. And you've only really got to look at other franchises. I mean, even Halloween, obviously that's kind of come back with a vengeance, and they've managed to kind of say, well, actually anything after the first Halloween in this kind of new kind of offshoot doesn't actually exist. So it's all very confusing. So now Laurie Strode isn't Michael Myers' sister in kind of like these new renditions, which is a little bit confusing. So you could continue the Jaws series after Jaws again. So it could almost be as soon as they, it could be Hooper and Brody getting to the shore, or it could be continued after 2, and so you completely disregard Jaws 3D and Jaws the Revenge, or you could have another version where you end up with like I wrote when I was in junior school, Jaws 5, which kind of paired up Hoagie and Matt Hooper when a great white shark came over to Cornwall.
Can you imagine that? Honestly, the thing is that's actually the real challenge, because I think it would be quite easy to pick up the story from the end of Jaws, or even Jaws 2, as you say, whether that's a revisit 20, 30 years later, or it's a story directly after those 2 movies. I would love to see someone attempt Jaws 5 directly after Jaws the Revenge. That's the movie I really want to see. It'd be like, so how do you pick up the story? Because obviously they just upped the game, haven't they? So Jaws was just a shark that ate everything and had to be dealt with. The second one was a shark that was, similar kind of story, but targeted kids. The third one was in a seawell, underwater sea kingdom. Fourth one was a shark that followed into the Bahamas because it had a vendetta against the family. Where do you take the bar from there? What is it? I mean, obviously Sharknado's done Jaws in space. So what do you go? Where do you go with that? I don't know. That's one for the audience. Let's leave to ponder that one. And I mean, talking of the audience, I mean, when we posted, because obviously when the rumour started online again, we felt we had to just basically say something, because we know a few people over at Universal, we know a few people in the filmmaking world. We reached out to them, and they were sort of like, it's rubbish, it's bullshit, it doesn't mean anything, it's just, it is what it is. It's like, okay, cool. And I think the main obstacle there is going to be Steven Spielberg anyway, because Steven Spielberg is so protective of Jaws, that so little has been done with it since 1987, like you say. It's kind of been fan-driven content, I think, that's really sort of kept it alive and in the public eye,
But then if he's so so I guess you're saying he's so protective of Jaws, the film he directed, because obviously if he was so protective of Jaws, okay, I can understand 1978, okay, it had Jaws, Close Encounters had come out, but certainly by 1983 and 1987, there was nothing to stop those 2 films, was there? So I guess he can only be protective of a remake of his AB, rather than another kind of Jaws film in some way, shape or form, unless he's managed to kind of wrangle some kind of thing now. I don't know.
I think it would need his it would need at least his eyes looking over it, I think, for it to really happen. Because I think
you're trying to say that his eyes looked over Jaws of Revenge?
Absolutely, he okayed that for sure. No, I think what it is now, because so much time has gone and the impact of Jaws now is really just, it's undeniable. And rather than it just being a cash in to continue the franchise and just try and make more money out of it, I think what would happen is, if whichever filmmaker it was that was involved, I think would, in some way, shape or form, was likely been inspired by Jaws in some way, shape or form, or is at least going to be employing some of the techniques that Jaws has used in the past, or they at least have to reference the movie. I mean, if I was asked to do it, massive Jaws fan or just a director or filmmaker, I'd like to speak to Spielberg about it and just say, these are the directions I'm going in. Do I have your blessing, or have you got a better idea? Which he probably does. I think Spielberg would need to be involved in the process some way, even if it was just yeah, this is okay. If, to your point, if we're picking up the story directly after my movie, I think this is where we need to go with it. I've just got the Twitter feed up while we were talking there, because there are some really interesting ideas and sort of just thoughts, because there seem to be sort of three key positions on the subject. One, which is absolutely not, which is no remake, don't go anywhere near it, it's a classic. And, you know, that seems to be the big majority of people. Other people are more, I'm kind of open to it from a curiosity point of view. And there are other people who are just like, explore the Jaws universe, be great to go back there again, but not as a direct remake of the movie, maybe a reboot or something else, or TV show. So that kind of seems to be the three sort of positions. But if I just go through a couple of the tweets, there was one. Now this first one interests me quite a lot, because we could actually be creating the problem. So this is from Paul Downey on Twitter, at Bloody Flicks, and he says, "It does feel increasingly inevitable. I would love to see a legacy sequel instead." So the thing that interests me about what Paul is saying is that he feels that it's increasingly inevitable. Now, is that because people keep publishing this clickbaity stuff and it's getting loads and loads of attention, therefore Universal will be going, actually, maybe we should do a remake based on this interest and this excitement? Or are they looking at the actual comments that people are saying, even though there's a lot of discussion around the topic, these are like, no, we don't want one because it will tarnish Jaws, you can't improve upon perfection, things like that. But then, to your point, Jaws was remade. Whether you want to see it or not, whether you agree with it or not, you're going to go see it, right?
Exactly. You can't tarnish a franchise that's already tarnished. So, and also those 2 or 3 films, whichever way you look at it, they've not tarnished Jaws. So if for some people, I mean, you know, I've seen Jaws 3D and Jaws Revenge more times than I've seen Citizen Kane and Lawrence of Arabia. So, you know, they're fine with me. I enjoy them. Obviously they're not Jaws, but I grew up with them. I can still enjoy them for schlocky kind of B movies, really. So I enjoy them on that level. But they don't make any dent or impact on the power of the original. In fact, they feel quite removed. Obviously, I think Jaws 2, as we said before, kind of feels very similar because it's got lots of the same cast and crew, the John Williams score. So, that seems very much in that same kind of universe. With the others, it's all completely different cast, apart from Lorraine Gary and a couple of supporting cast members in Jaws and Revenge. So I think with all that in mind, they don't feel like Jaws films in that sense. But so I think that's fine. But it was trying to do something that was different. So you either get lambasted for kind of trying to stick too closely to whatever's worked before, and if you do stuff that's too different, people complain about that as well. So there's always a degrees of losing in the kind of sequel and even remake game. I mean, you've only got to look at, and this was a Universal film, obviously Gus Van Sant did a shot-by-shot remake, essentially, of Psycho. Yeah. So, but again, I guess there would be a certain amount of people who wouldn't have watched, although it was Alfred Hitchcock, they wouldn't have watched a black and white film, whereas they would a colour one. I'm not saying that's right at all, but that's what some people that have seen it as an old film. There'll be some people who won't watch Jaws because it's a film from the 1970s. So I think there's also that from a Universal point of view. Will it open the doors for people to kind of get into Jaws and the Jaws franchise? So if someone watches that, then will they watch the originals? It's a possibility. There'll be people who watch Godzilla versus Kong who obviously will watch King of the Monsters and Skull Island, but they'll go back further. They'll go back to the Peter Jackson version. or at the same time when that's out, there'll be more screenings on TV of the Roland Emmerich Godzilla, which is obviously absolutely nothing to do with it, or even the original Japanese ones, or I know the 19. Obviously, I'm sure it's not a coincidence that the extended TV version of the 1976 version of King Kong is coming out, because obviously Kong and Godzilla Mania is going to be at a peak again. So all those things make sense from a film company point of view, and we've got to remember that at the end of the day, although it is about entertainment, it is also very much about it is a company, so it's about making money.
And I think it's a really interesting point you make about people then probably going back to revisit the original source material. But my counter against that is, because there's nothing wrong with that, but ultimately the thing is you'll be watching them in the wrong order. You'll be looking at the new one, and then you'll look at Jaws, the original, and you think, oh, it's not as good, because maybe you're a fairly new audience member. If you haven't seen Jaws by now, it's probably because maybe you're under 20, under 25. It's just not a movie that's necessarily on your radar as a classic in that way. Whereas for mine and your generation, so 30, 35 and over, Jaws would have been in our childhood. That's kind of the point I'm making. So you would watch Jaws retrospectively after, say, watching a remake, and it might actually damage your appreciation of the original movie. I remember watching Jaws with a friend of mine a few years ago. She'd never seen it, and she was gripped. She was absolutely gripped. But she knew about filmmaking, and she knew about what a good film is, rather than just being one of these mindless people that just watches anything and thinks everything's great. She does understand good movie making. And after we watched it, she said, so how much green screen was used? And I'm like, when do you think this movie was made? And she said, I don't know, 1990? And I'm like, 1975. And she was like, what? Yeah, 1975. And then I started to explain to her how they built the shark on the platform, the track on the ground, and the arm, and then the actual the animatronic shark on the top, and how they maneuvered it using hydraulics and things like that. She was blown away by actually how much work that took to make that film. And I think that this isn't to say that working in special effects, particularly CGI as they are now, is any less of a difficult thing to do, but you're not out on a boat in the ocean against the elements with a practical prop. They're poles apart. And I just wouldn't want someone to watch a Jaws remake that's likely to be CGI or heavily CGI'd, and then go back to the original and not think that much of it in terms of the physical craft that went into making that film. Another tweet here that's caught my eye. This is from Aaron Pilkington. I wonder if he's a relation of Carl Pilkington. He says, and this spoke for a lot of people, he said, my only real problem with a remake would be the casting. Everyone was just so perfect in the original. That, for me, is a very, very good point. A very good point. Because, as we know, Jaws has got, and we're not just talking about the main characters. We're not just talking about Robert Shaw as Quint, Richard Dreyfuss as Hooper, and Roy Scheider as Chief Brody. We're talking about all of the characters involved in this, particularly the supporting players. Everyone was brilliantly cast. I mean, you generally can't imagine anybody else in those roles. You really can't. I mean, Murray Hamilton as Mayor Vaughan, come on, give me a break. No one's going to play him better. So I think if they were to go down a direct remake route, the biggest obstacle to get the audience buy-in is going to be the casting of those main characters. And I think obviously you've got some big Hollywood stars of the time now who could very well, from an acting point of view, would very easily be able to act in this movie and play those parts. But would they be cast as actors who are just designed to get bums on seats, or because they're a big name, or would they do what Jaws did when they couldn't get the actors they wanted and actually cast relative unknowns or not super A-list stars, which just made the reality of the characters a bit more believable? That for me is a big sticking point. That's where the remake argument kind of falls down in a big way. What do you think about that?
I guess some people kind of say that James Bond has been remaking itself for decades, and obviously there was people who were like, "Well, you can never replace Sean Connery," but obviously that kind of happened, and has happened several times. So, and obviously they are different films and in different decades, so it is very difficult. Yeah, I guess it does go back to things like Psycho. I mean, Anthony Perkins was so amazing as Norman Bates. So, arguably Vince Vaughn, is not a patch on it. But then you've got, I mean, even things like with obviously you had Manhunter. You had a very good Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter, but then it's kind of completely redefined, wasn't it, with Anthony Hopkins, and then again on TV you got Mads Mikkelsen. So it's and on paper that would look like a completely crazy idea to kind of have someone else playing Hannibal Lecter. And even down the Norman Bates route, obviously that went TV, and we had Bates Motel, so with Freddie Highmore. So it can be done, and just because those people have played it so well in the past, it doesn't mean that other people can't bring their own stamp to it. And I think it's no different than kind of having a film done or a TV series done in a different time. It doesn't scrub out the person who played it in the past. I mean, who else thought that you could have anyone else play Superman rather than Christopher Reeve? And obviously, again, back to us, there is no other Superman. But actually, Henry Cavill is actually a pretty damn fine Superman as he's kind of gone on. And I think we've said the same with Ben Affleck. His Batfleck has kind of really changed perception of, I think, what makes a good Batman. I mean, even after how well Christian Bale did, with that many Batmans now, but again, he kind of raised the bar, and we didn't think we were going to get another Batman, and yet again, we've got Robert Pattinson, who's going to be yet another Batman. So I know they're very different films; they're not remakes, but obviously they're very kind of similar kind of plot points, and his mum and dad have died more times than kind of care to mention in different films. So if they can do it, we've had what, 3 Spider-Man actors now. So yeah. So I'm not saying they should do it, but they could do it.
This is the thing. It could be done. I think it could be done. I wouldn't necessarily want to see it unless it was really in the hands of a really good filmmaker. Because I think the thing as well, when you mention people like Henry Cavill as Superman, and also to a degree James Bond, even though it's a slightly different scenario, but when you get the right actor and the right director together, then you can make something really special, which is why something like the James Bond movies, when you look at them, some are stronger than others, I think, because sometimes the scripts are just better, but also when you look at the way the director is working with a particular actor, I think it probably shows up more in Roger Moore, and also probably Pierce Brosnan. I think he's probably the most inconsistent Bond in terms of material that he's had to work with. But when you look at, say, like you say, Henry Cavill and Superman, it was very obvious that Henry Cavill was a great fit for Zack Snyder's vision for Superman. Yeah. And that's the thing. So if you get the right director with the right vision, and then you bring in the right actor who can do that, then who knows? I mean, the irony of the conversation, I think, when it comes to casting, is obviously we can't imagine anybody else playing Quint. Robert Shaw is Quint. There's no argument about it. But if they had cast someone else, we'd be talking about them possibly in the same way now. Do you know what I mean? So it's exactly. It's a really tricky thing to do. But I think because you've got Spielberg as the director with his vision, and those 3 actors combining together so well, that's where the casting comes from. I don't think it's about particularly individual roles. It's about how they all blended and worked together. I think that's possibly the issue. There was, because I've just been thinking about what you were talking about there, and there was one film that I was watching recently. It's only been out a few years, and I think I've only ever watched it twice. And there's you're going to laugh at this, but there are certain shots in it that reminded me of the way Jaws was shot when they did the out to sea parts of it. And then when I started thinking about it a bit more, I think maybe this director could be a good choice for a Jaws remake if they were to go down that route, or even a Jaws reboot, revisit, whatever they call it. And the movie was Dunkirk. Now it's the bit when the boats that they're coming from England and they're trying to just come and pick people up from Dunkirk. When you watch some of that, it really reminded me of Jaws, the way it was shot, water level inside the boat. The conditions were very similar, I think, as well, and just the use of the camera and lighting and the way they staged it all. And I thought, that's interesting. And I started to think, well, Christopher Nolan potentially doing a Jaws remake would be very interesting, I think, because I think he'd bring a sort of sense of scale. I think Steven Spielberg, even though it was quite obviously a very carefully planned out movie from the logistics and the shots and everything like that, I think, if anything, and this is where, again, when it comes to sequels and things like that, I think, for me, Aliens is better than Alien, even though they're two very different movies, but I can watch Aliens more because it's more expansive and it's very character-driven, whereas Alien was much more, and I'm simplifying here, I do recognise Alien as a classic, but it's basically a haunted house in space, whereas Aliens is much, much more. And I think if we could find a director who could maybe expand on that universe with those characters, or descendants of those characters in some way, or something like that, and shoot it in an expansive, grand way where it really just builds on what's already there as the foundation in the original Jaws, then I might be interested in something like that. I think I could see something like that. But that's the only kind of thing that directly comes to mind about, from the ground up, where would you start with a Jaws remake? And I think it starts with the director. And I think that's one of the key choices. And I think Nolan would be a good choice, or possibly Denis Villeneuve, maybe. He did an amazing job in Blade Runner. But I don't know. It's a tricky one to call.
Again, with that, I think that's something that people said, how can you possibly do although I know it's a sequel, not a remake, how could you possibly do a sequel to Blade Runner? But obviously, I think an awful lot of fans do enjoy that, don't they? So it's so it is possible. But as I say, that's a sequel, not a remake. So
this is the thing, isn't it? It's a direct remake that I think worries people, and I think a sequel or a prequel or a Mandalorian type spin-off or something like that would be more comfortable for Jaws fans, I think, because it's more acceptable, and we've seen that getting done quite well now, I think, quite a lot. Okay, I'm just looking at the article that you wrote as well, just about this. So the article is called Jaws Flaws, Why There Should Never Be a Jaws Remake. So we talked a little bit about the cast in terms of, how could you replace the perfect cast? But one of the other points that you raised, and I think this is a really good one, is we'd be shown too much shark. So when it comes to the shark itself, obviously in Jaws, the physical shark itself is only on screen for about 4 minutes out of 124 minutes, which is a minuscule amount of time. The shark is hinted at. But now, because as we've already said, there have been so many shark movies. There have been different spin-offs, different takes on it. Some are absolutely ludicrous. Some have tried to ground it in some kind of reality. But it always comes down to being shown the shark. What does the shark look like? And also, how is it done? Is it practical effect? Is it CGI? Most of the time, it's CGI mapped over some kind of practical effect or something like that. Just talking about the shark, if it was, say, a Jaws remake or revisit or reboot or whatever it is, in terms of the actual shark itself, how would we get around that particular issue? Because now everybody knows what a shark looks like. We're very knowledgeable about sharks, and it's very easy to find out about sharks. Whereas back in 1975, when Jaws came out, sharks weren't really in the public eye that much. So we were really able to suspend that disbelief when it came to the original Jaws.
I think absolutely it's got to be practical effects for the most part. I think you've only got to look at the animatronics in Deep Blue Sea are still amazing. The CGI is PS2 level at the best when it goes to grab Samuel L. Jackson. But
Is it that good?
But the practical effects, they still look absolutely amazing. And you also you got to kind of have a look at Jurassic Park as well. And Jurassic Park, I think, is still looks amazing today. And that people think it's all CGI, but actually there's such a little amount of CGI in there. So I think that's the thing with effects. It's got to be practical effects where you can use them, and then it's supplemented by CGI to kind of help give you that lift up where you kind of need it. But the sort of T-Rex, the Velociraptors, for the most part, that was all practical. That was all kind of like a built model, and that's why Jurassic Park still looks as good as it does today. And it still looks better than a lot of stuff where it will just be purely CG. I mean, even with the Snyder cut of Justice League, there's bits in that way it kind of just jumps into kind of CGI stuff, and it's kind of like, I don't know if it's just something in your brain or what, but as you were saying earlier, there's still an awful lot of work that goes into that kind of thing, but it just doesn't seem, I don't know, it just didn't seem right. And I think what you're saying about the seeing the shark, I think it would be a very different film anyway, because we would have to see a lot more shark, because it is no surprise now, as you say, there's been a lot of shark films, and that was the thing with Jaws 2, 3 and 4. They had to show more shark because there was no point in hiding it, because it had all been introduced to it. But then again, similarly with Alien, there's about 4 minutes of Alien scene in that, because a lot of the time it was in the shadows, and obviously we get a hell of a lot more in Aliens and even Alien 3, where there's like one alien we kind of see more of that as well, and even in Predator, where I think there's about okay, so he can camouflage himself, so he kind of gets around that quite easily of being seen. But there was about 7 minutes of screen time for the for the Predator in Predator. But obviously in Predator 2, we got to see a lot more of it, and even more in sort of Alien versus Predator and things like that. So I think inevitably we would see more shark, which will make it a different film anyway, which therefore kind of takes it down a slightly different route, which I think is no different than having like the Kelvin timeline in Star Trek, if you like, with J.J. Abrams. So because it's being made at a different time, you can't do it exactly the same, and that would be a completely pointless exercise. So I think we would get more shark. Yes, we'd all moan about seeing more shark, but actually, if the shark is great, then we'd all love seeing more shark. So I think that's the thing. If the shark is as great as it could and it should be, then that would be amazing. And I guess it would seem almost silly not to kind of go and speak to people like Greg Nicotero and things about doing a practical shark, seeing as he's kind of resurrected the last remaining Bruce shark. So that would just make a whole lot of sense to me.
I think the difficulty I have with the shark scenario, because you're right, with the sequels, just talking about the Jaws franchise, you do get to see more shark. That's what people are paying their buck for. But then you have to become more elaborate. You can't just show the shark. You've got to have it do stuff, which is, obviously typified in Jaws: The Revenge, where it's balancing on its tail and roaring. Anyway, but the other thing as well is, it's interesting that you mentioned Jurassic Park. I can't remember. I saw a stat where I think Jurassic Park only has 75 effects shots in it. Even though when you think about the film, you probably remember it as maybe being more. It's only 75. And then when you look at, I think it was one of the Transformers films, I think it was something like 300 plus. Now, when we look at effects-driven movies, or even movies with a monster in it that's going to require some level of special effects, the ones we talk about are the ones where you don't really see the monster that much. So, for example, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Jaws, Jurassic Park as well, I would argue, to a degree. Obviously, toward the
Yeah.
end we see much more. But those other films that are just, special effects driven, extravaganzas where there's just an explosion every 30 seconds, we don't really talk about those. They're kind of, they've been and gone. They're an attention grabber, and then it's off, it's next. It's almost like flicking through Instagram. Like you just got this conveyor belt of content you can just consume, and it's not very memorable. What was the movie you saw last week? Don't remember. When did you see Jaws for the first time? I remember that. But also, say for example, if you've got an average movie of say 2 hours long, the more time you dedicate to the shark, it gives you less time with the characters. And the thing about Jaws, probably more than, and well, maybe like Alien as well, and Aliens to that degree, you remember the characters. You go back to look at the characters, and it's the investment in the characters and the construction of the characters that makes you invest in them, so that when shit does hit the fan, so the sharks attacking the boat, the aliens are swarming Hadley's Hope or whatever it happens to be, it's not just about man versus aliens. It's like, shit, I hope they get out of this. And oh my God, they didn't make it out. Shit, only 3 of them survived. What's going to happen next? Which is why when Alien 3 rocks around, and spoiler, Hicks and Newt are killed, it's like, what a kick in the nuts that was. And that's where Jaws stands alone. And I think that's what makes it really tricky to tackle the shark problem as well as the casting problem. Because if you give it too much shark, you're robbing the audience time of this character development, which is why Jaws is such a successful movie, and it's such a memorable movie and stays with people and can stand the test of time on its own without the need for a remake, in my opinion. But it's a challenge. And again, just to summarise this briefly, because I know we've been talking about this point for a while. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to see as much practical effects in a Jaws movie as possible, because I think Jaws is almost like the ultimate homage to practical filmmaking. It's not just the fact that it was used really well, very smartly. Okay, the shark didn't work, but it ultimately, they had to have some shark in the movie, and they made it work as well as they possibly could. Plus, you put that in the open ocean, which is like the ultimate sort of environment, or ultimate hostile environment to try and work in. It's like that's an amazing achievement on its own. So I would love to see a deep blue sea practical effect version, but out in the open sea. That kind of thing. I'd love to see something like that. That would be really cool. Without obviously overseeing it too much, because then you're robbing yourself of a load of character and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think certainly for the first half of the film, it would need to be very much unseen. But I think in the second half, you could perhaps see more of the actual animatronic. And really, I think a lot of shark films do that, just because of cost and those kind of things. So even if you look at things like The Shallows and stuff, you don't see that much of the shark, until certainly till we get to towards the end and things. So I think again, there will be that kind of thing where for that tension, it's no different than kind of showing Freddie or whoever else. You can't kind of show everything too early, because you've got no place to go, so you can't start with a 10, because you've got nowhere to go when it comes to your, whether it's your Ben Gardner or whether it's Alex Kittesine, etc. You've got nowhere to go, so you've got to kind of have some of that kind of tension building, certainly in that first half. But I think if they're at sea, then I think we can potentially see more shark, and I think we would have done if it had been working more. I think we're still going to get the sort of POV of the shark and things like that, because it's now such a shorthand for shark in cinema, or same. Obviously it's the same for Michael Myers and those kind of things. It was that kind of POV kind of steady cam and stuff like that. So it's I think it's all part and parcel of that genre, and I think probably every other shark film has kind of done that. But I think it is not necessarily show and tell right from the beginning, but I think we'll need more show later on.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's why, to be honest with you, I admire movies like Sharknado, because it's just, okay, cool, it's like Jaws: The Revenge turned up to 11. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's going to be loads of sharks. They're not maybe going to look as great as maybe you'd like them to look. The CGI is not going to be amazing, particularly in the first one. But obviously, as they've got more budget, throughout the series, the sharks improve. But we're going to get them to do just crazy things. we're going to do things with sharks that you've never even seen before, and it's so ridiculous. You've got no help but just to buy into it, And I think apart from that kind of shark movie kind of genre kind of thing where it's just crazy, I think you're right. A gradual reveal of the shark, and then as you say, it just builds up over time throughout the movie. Because obviously that's what people ultimately have come to see. Sorry, you going to say something? Or?
I was just, I think as well, I know in the article I said that Jaws would have to be a very different film than what it was then, because obviously our understanding of sharks is very different. But we've got to remember that actually this is a piece of fiction. It's not real. So when we get other films that are kind of about, creature features or even in space or action movies and things like that, then obviously it kind of is only got to make sense in the filmic world. And it's even established in Jaws that the shark is not a sort of standard shark in that sense. It's kind of, we've never had one like this before in these waters, so it is an anomaly in that sense. So I think it doesn't have to necessarily. And because there are that many shark films now, it's not as if you release another Jaws film that sort of people are going to go out and kill more sharks, because I think we've all moved on from that place.
I don't think many people actually did that in the first place, to be honest with you.
No,
I mean, Jaws has created a perception problem, but I don't think many people proactively went out to try and hunt and kill sharks. When you talk about these millions and millions of sharks that are killed every year, that's down to just industrial fishing.
Yeah,
it's that simple, as we know. But I was literally just scrolling through the article, and the next thing that we were going to talk about was the story. And I think, if Jaws was to be remade, but it was set in the modern day, I think the story would have to be, because this is the interesting angle that you could potentially take with a Jaws remake. And Misty Tally came up with a great idea about the sharks attacking optic fiber cables for the internet, stuff like that. So people have to go down and tackle this problem. Because obviously you need a reason to be in the water. But what I think would be a very interesting Jaws remake or reboot, or however you want to do it, is if you've got almost exactly the same scenario. So giant shark anomaly, as we've discussed, comes to a seaside town and just starts attacking people. But this time, because we know so much about sharks and we know that they're just behaving potentially in a natural way, they found a new food supply, so they're going to, eat what they can while they're there. You've got two sides of the same story now. You've obviously got, maybe Chief Brody, who's duty bound to deal with this problem. You've got Matt Hooper, who is there to obviously ultimately deal with the problem one way or the other, but from a slightly more rational point of view in terms of science. Quint, who just is out there just to kill it because he hates them. And you've got Mayor in between all of that, who's trying to keep the beaches open for the sake of the economy of the town. But then you throw into the mix of that people who are actually aware of sharks and appreciate them for the creatures that they are. And then all of a sudden you've got an even bigger conflict, because now you've got an opposing side. And I think that something like, almost like I don't like to use the word protest, but just a real human stand where you've got two opposing people in the two different parties in the town. One trying to keep the shark alive, keep the people safe, but also deal with the problem. There you've got sort of like a multi-pronged story straight away. And, ultimately, if that happened in real life, you would probably just close the beaches and hope the shark left. But let's say if the beaches were closed and the shark just didn't go away, how do you humanely deal with this problem?
I think we've seen that in real life a little bit, haven't we? In whether it's Australia, or certainly even in Cape Cod. So they've had more and more great white sharks turning up there. And on the one hand, obviously it's not great for business for if you've got a surf school, but if you're doing excursions in boats, or if you're selling shark tea towels or whatever else, then you're probably doing a roaring trade. So, like with everything else, is even with COVID, there's kind of businesses that are winning and businesses that are losing. So there's always some dollars to be made somewhere.
Nice. And to be honest, I mean, it's the thing that comes to my mind is something that Johan Rannikin said. Johan Rannikin, for those of you that don't know, he's a shark photographer, and he also runs cage diving with great whites out in Guadalupe. We did an interview with him just before Christmas. Really sound guy. And we were talking about sharks and how they just have different personalities and how they have different approaches to things. Like there's one particular shark called Red, I think its name was, and if there are seagulls anywhere, those seagulls won't last very long because he will just take them all. You know, if they're just sitting on the water, they haven't got a chance against him. This is what he loves. So you throw into the, you know, to the fact that, you know, you've got a particular shark with a particular personality, and if it's a massive shark, say like Deep Blue, which is reported to be around 20 feet long, and then you throw that into this social situation where we now know a lot more about sharks and their importance and things like that. There you've got a massively different story, but the same scenario. So I'd love to see that worked out. I would be interested in that because then it's a fair reflection of the shark and the issues around that. I mean, can you imagine if there was a Jaws story somewhere where there was a fishing town where there wasn't, say, a huge amount of money? It wasn't a particularly well-to-do area. I watched this documentary called Seaspiracy recently, and they were talking about overfishing and things like that, and the topic of sharks came up and how sharks are just, you know, they're unfortunate victims of bycatch, and that's where a lot of these sort of shark deaths come from every year. But they can't just stop fishing because that's what that town is based on in terms of its economy. You know, people would starve to death if they suddenly just packed it up and went home. So you've got the social economic issue surrounding it as well. Now, whether, you know, you've got a socially economical, political shark movie, whether that's something that Universal or any studio for that matter would be interested in doing, I don't know. But it could be an interesting way to take the story potentially. Just new attitudes, but the same problem. You know, how do we tackle it?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is right about us knowing more about sharks and things, though, and I think that would. I mean, I guess this sounds crazy, but I guess the shark in Jaws is quite one-dimensional, whereas today, because we know so much more, he'd certainly be able to have. There's no reason why he couldn't have as much character, in a sense, as Quint, Brody, and Hooper. Obviously, I don't mean he would be doing wisecracks or anything like that. I don't mean a talking shark, but you know, I think just because we know much more about sharks, that you know that throughout the film we can kind of introduce a little bit more than just kind of Brody flicking through a book. Although there's still an awful lot more that we don't know about sharks. You know, I don't think they're as mysterious to us as they were back in 1974, 75. No. So I think that would kind of help create a more rounded shark character. And as you say, I think that would then probably mean that it would have to. They couldn't just be kind of done as some. They don't have to necessarily be done as some kind of senseless killer. But likewise, you know, there's no reason why they couldn't be, because they are in other films, and it doesn't mean that that's representing what they are. But I think obviously there'll be a lot more, and I think again it would act as another jumping off point for people finding out more about shark conservation and that kind of thing. So I think that kind of thing would have to be touched on in there. But I think even if it was, you know, I mean, as we know from things we've done, but you know, they're not. They're portrayed by media often as senseless killers, but they're not. We just happen to be in their realm. You know, it's no different than going. You wouldn't go for a jog in the Serengeti and get away from being sort of pulled down by a big cat or anything. So it's no different. Obviously, it's a bit like airplane crashes and things like that. It just sounds more, because it's such a rare event. It sounds more tragic than it actually is. And yes, we know more people get killed by bee stings or dogs or cows even, but obviously
machines.
Yeah. But obviously it's not as impactful in that way.
No, so that's the thing, isn't it? It's all about just trying to sell a newspaper. I mean, there was a story this week. I think it was a surfer in New Zealand had a shark encounter, and it was shark horror was the headline. And it's like, well, actually, it's just an accident. It's an encounter. A shark is, you know, as we know, sharks are super curious animals. You know, it's their job to be curious because they're the guardians of the ocean. They're there to make sure that order is maintained. And, you know, if, to your point, if we go out into their environment, we should probably expect an encounter of some sort with the sea life. You know,
And I think that's the kind of thing that's missing, that kind of is missing from Jaws, you know, back in '75, that wouldn't be now. And I think it's that kind of thing that Peter Benchley touched upon. You know, he said that Jaws would be very different if it was kind of redone now. And I think it would be sort of those kind of things. And I think that's the kind of thing that Matt Hooper would be saying these days, and sort of talking about it being a rogue shark and things like that. So I think he kind of very much put it into kind of context rather than it kind of demonising sharks. So a Jaws remake may actually be good for sharks.
It potentially could. I was literally, as you were saying that, I was just thinking, because when you know, sort of the main theme of the original Jaws is fear, and, you know, specifically Brody's fear, not just of the water, but just, you know, not being good enough, basically, and not being able to save the day, you know, not just for the town, but for his own kids and family and all that sort of stuff. But that's a completely different conversation. But this time, the fear itself, because the one thing we now know about, or a lot of the things that we know about sharks now, make them less frightening, less scary. So you could potentially watch Jaws now, the original, I mean, with this knowledge of sharks, and go, actually, that's still relatively accurate. It's behaving, you know, in a shark kind of way. Okay, it gets a bit crazy towards the end, but it's doing what a shark does. That's it.
Yeah.
You know, it will encounter. I mean, for every shark attack that we see, there's probably thousands of shark encounters that don't result in attacks that we don't even know about. So I think, yeah, it's a very interesting thing, because now, actually, a Jaws remake potentially, or a Jaws revisit, should we say, could be good for sharks, because now we've got all that information at our fingertips, and if that information is layered into the story, it helps us bring a brand new perspective to the same story, the same problem, the same challenge, but figure out a way to coexist rather than just shove a scuba tank in its gob and blow it up.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, I think obviously people are still going to want the kind of thriller and horror elements, aren't they? So, you know, but then, you know, doing another Jaws film would be no different than doing, you know, Twister is Jaws with tornadoes, isn't it? So it's got fact and stuff in there, and they can be in awe of that, and there'll be all sorts of facts, but also obviously it does kind of get Hollywoodized and things like that. And it's the same with, you know, even like Day After Tomorrow or whatever, and other things like that. So I think, you know, I think for it to kind of maintain its kind of horror thriller elements, you know, there are still going to have to be those kind of key kind of deaths and key kind of moments. But I think weaved in there that there could well be that. But, you know, I'm not saying it's going to be, it's not going to be Free Willy with a great white shark or anything like that.
You just give me a great idea. Twist ending. It was Pipet all along. Pipet, after all these years, he's just been sitting there waiting for people just to forget about the shark. He will go swimming, and he's the one doing it. There's your story right there. That's like Usual Suspects, isn't it? Sorry, that's a terrible idea. Okay, so let's round this off, because I think we've talked around it really, really well. I think we've sort of covered a lot, and I think we've addressed most of people's concerns. On the whole, if you had to fall in one camp, where are you on the Jaws remake debate now?
I'd watch it. So I say, bring it on.
Wow. Okay.
I think bring it on, and I think the time is kind of right. If you look at if you probably look at the amount of films that are being made about sharks, and shark thrillers and that kind of thing. I mean, just the sheer number this year and next year alone, I don't ever remember there being quite so many. So I think there's that. I think we're kind of rapidly swimming towards the 50th anniversary of Jaws. I think it's the only way we'd get to see the Jaws ride come back. So for that alone, that may well be worth it, because we know that the Jurassic Park ride got a revamp when they did Jurassic World and things like that. Obviously, there was a bit of a break after Jurassic Park 3, and that kind of got... I mean, essentially, Jurassic World is kind of part Jurassic Park, part Jaws 3D. hybrid in many ways.
Mm.
So I know that's a sequel, but obviously that was kind of taken in a slightly different direction. So yeah, and it's, you know, if it's terrible, it's not going to destroy my enjoyment of watching Jaws or 2 or 3D or 4. It'll just mean that I've got another film to kind of pop on and watch. And that's if they did do it kind of film wise. As we kind of mentioned before, there's potential for TV
Mm.
series, and it could even go down that difficult to juggle route with The Exorcist, the TV series. The first series of that was both a kind of reimagining in many ways, but also it was a direct sequel as well. So it kind of
Mm.
worked really well in that sense. So it kind of had its cake and ate it. So whether Jaws could do the same, I don't know, but I'd go and see it. Wouldn't stop me going to see it. Yeah, I might hate it, but you know, I think the Jaws fandom, it's a broad church of people. As we said before, some people love Jaws and don't like any of the others. Others like Jaws and Jaws 2, but disregard 3 and 4. Some people prefer 4 over 3D, but I think the time is probably right for us to kind of have a Jaws follow-up or Jaws sequel in some way, shape, or form, and that would certainly get me going back to the cinema.
Yeah, I'm in a very similar place to you. I don't think a remake would really work. I just, you can't recapture what was already made, and I think the backlash from fans would be too much. I don't think it would kind of be a very flash in the pan. I think it would be gone very quickly. Like you say, sort of people don't even associate some of the sequels with the franchise; they just see it as something else. So I don't think people would have too much of an issue to dismiss it. But then again, you don't want it to be dismissed to a point where it diminishes the rest of the franchise, which I don't think it would. Jaws, as we say, is such a strong movie on its own. I think I would love to revisit Amity Island, though. I'd love to see how that story would be tackled now. Now, with all these new political problems that we've got, even though some of them are still going on 50 years, nearly 50 years later, you know, Mayor Vaughan is your go-to politician whenever you're comparing a world leader who's making a really bad decision, particularly during the coronavirus. You know, the coronavirus lockdown, beaches open, beaches closed. Very similar thing, and we've seen that so much. And I think Jaws, it opens itself up. It lends itself nicely to a new modern commentary on these political problems, but also some of the environmental stuff with sharks. So I think for me, I'd love a revisit, but I would have some caveats. I think for me, it starts with the director. For me, I think it just starts with the director and the storytellers behind the movie. So just someone, you know, a trusted pair of hands who would do a really good job. So not Michael Bay, not when there's going to be 800 special effects, everything CGI and everything explodes every 4 seconds. No, thank you. You know, someone who really understands how to tell a character-driven story, but balances it with that, you know, fantastical quality. I think that's what Spielberg is kind of, you know, really, really good at. So I'm not totally against it. I'm not against it. I just think it would need to be done in a very certain way for it to be a success. Because the thing for me is, I think the Jaws franchise, the way that it went, is one of the worst and one of the biggest wasted opportunities in movie history, if you want my honest opinion. I think Jaws 2, they tried to make it trendy, you know, by appeasing, you know, the cinema-going audience who were sort of just fascinated by teen slasher flicks at the time, which is what we ended up getting. Whereas the thing that I think about Jaws 2 every time I watch it, I just think, oh, if only John Hancock hadn't been fired. Because he was probably going to take it in a much different direction. We could be talking about the franchise in a much different way, where, you know, we could have 4 or 5 Jaws movies and they could all be actually pretty good. But, you know, at that time in the industry, it just didn't happen. So I'm not against it. Absolutely not. I just think for it to satisfy me, I think it would just need to have a very sensible pair of hands just directing it and making that film. You couldn't just give it to anybody, I don't think. Which is one of the gambles I think that potentially a studio like Universal may do, because, you know, it's Jaws. He's got the strength of the brand, so you don't necessarily need a particularly strong pair of hands there. It could just be a quick cash grab that just kind of just shows that actually they don't really see it as a particularly valuable franchise. Original movie, absolutely, but the rest of the franchise is like, let's just make some money. So it could be an opportunity to really reinvigorate it in the same way The Mandalorian did for Star Wars on TV. I'd love to see, some kind of TV show based in Amity or something like that. I think that would probably be the way I'd like to see it. But yeah. Okay, so guys, that's our discussion on Jaws remake, I think. We've talked about pretty much everything I think that we need to talk about on that. But what do you think? What do you think about a Jaws remake? Do you think now's the time? Do you think we should be looking at it from a TV series or a reboot or prequels? What would you like to see? Leave your comments below. Tweet us. We're on Instagram. We're also on Facebook as well. So come follow us. That's at The Daily Jaws. So, Dean, any final words that you'd like to add before we disembark?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah, I just think the Times, exactly, I was dead against it for years and years. But I think I agree with Paul Downey. I think it kind of has that kind of inevitability to it as more time continues, and whether that be leading up to the 50th anniversary or whether Universal decide to do it when Spielberg's no longer with us, I don't know. But I think at some point, just with the numbers of shark films that are coming out, it just makes complete sense for there to be another Jaws film in some way, shape or form, whether it's remake or quasi-sequel.
Yeah, good shout. Okay, guys, well, thanks so much for watching it. We really do appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed this. We'll be doing more videos and discussions about this or about topics. If there's anything else you'd like us to talk about, please drop us a comment, let us know, or you can email us at mail@thedailyjaws.com. But until then, we drink to your legs. Farewell and adieu.
Drink to your legs. Bye.
Guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can learn about Jaws, sharks, movie making and everything in between. Also be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok and Instagram, and be sure to check out our website, thedailyjaws.com. Until next time, we drink to your legs. Farewell and adieu.